physiologic actions of aldosterone. Is a straightforward slide. It basically says, okay, aldosterone has its effect on the kidney. Aldosterone is predominantly a kidney. But even though its major ability, aldosterone, retains salt and excrete hydrogen ions, retains salt and excrete potassium, where else in the body would you expect aldosterone to have its effect? Kidney and colon and sweat glands. Kidney, colon, sweat glands. See here where it says, oh, sweat, salivary, colon. So aldosterone will have its sodium retaining capacity just as much in the distal tubule as it will in the colon. What is a colon but the distal convoluted tube of your guts? And what is the distal tubule but the colon of your kidney? They follow the same thing. Salivary glands. You might be like, come on, what difference does it make taking the salt and water out of salivary glands? That's no big deal. Saliva. Really? How much saliva do you think you make a day? Even if you're only 5'1". How juicy are you? Do you know how much saliva you make a day? 1 to 2 liters. Even if you're small, 1 to 2 liters. Well, that must mean I make 3 liters. 3 liters. So the thing is, wow, 1 to 2 liters. I got to think, ready? Do you know that you make twice as much saliva as you do urine a day? Twice as much saliva. How come you don't notice it? Because you end up, you re-ingest it, which is, I'm trying to avoid the word, swallowing it. Yeah, that's why you don't notice it. But you could spit out 1 liter or 2 a day. That's why it is that people who have an ileus, a paralyzed bowel, have to get nasogastric suction. Because other than that, they could have a backup of 2 liters a day of saliva. So you have to suction it out. You have to suction it out. So taking salt and water out of saliva is a much bigger deal than you think, because you don't realize that you only make, on average, 600 milliliters to 1 liter a day of urine, but you make 1 to 2 liters a day of saliva. Wow. Remember, everyone who has high aldosterone also becomes alkalotic because you're excreting hydrogen ions. And everyone who has a high aldosterone also ends up being hypokalemic. That's why metabolic alkalosis and hypokalemia, metabolic alkalosis and hypokalemia is an expected part of primary hyperaldosteronisms. Hyperaldosteronisms create alkalosis and hypokalemia. Now, the intercalated cells and the principal cells is just breaking down the 2 different types of cells from the distal tubule. Intercalated and principal. Well, it's just saying that the cells are super specialized. One gets rid of hydrogen, acid. The other gets rid of potassium. Now you might say, well, which one is it? I absorb 1 sodium and I excrete a hydrogen or potassium. Which one? Well, it depends on what your body needs. If you've got too much potassium, you need to get rid of potassium, it'll absorb the sodium and get rid of the potassium. If you're too acidotic, it'll absorb the sodium and get rid of the acid. That's pretty cool, man. Pretty cool. This is an actual cartoon and picture of the thing I just said. This says that as I'm absorbing my sodium, I'm going to excrete a potassium or I'm going to excrete a hydrogen ion. Which one will actually be chosen? It depends on what your body needs. Aldosterone oversecretion automatically means you are hypertensive. Aldosterone oversecretion as a primary defect means automatically that you are hypertensive. However, you can't say automatically whether you'll get alkalotic or hypokalemic. It depends on what the body's condition are. Now, the energy-dependent step is here at the basal membrane. The basal membrane means the blood end. The basal membrane means the blood end. The hydrogen is excreted in the lumen, but the energy-dependent step is here at the basal membrane. The energy-dependent step is here at the basal membrane. Now, step 1 is very big on you knowing where the energy is split. Step 1 is very big on knowing where is the enzyme active step, where is the active transport. And the active transport is on the basal membrane, and basal means the blood. Basal membrane means the blood side. That's how you know where the energy-dependent step is. Here's the next question. Is the bicarbonate that is generated here in the distal tubule, is that bicarbonate there? Is that a new bicarbonate, or is it simply a reabsorbed old bicarb? In the distal tubule, is this a new bicarbonate, or is it a recycled old bicarbonate? And the answer is that in the distal convoluted tubule, it is a new bicarbonate. The proximal tubule reabsorbs an old bicarb. The bicarb got filtered in the glomerulus, bring it back in. The bicarb got filtered in the glomerulus, bring it back in. But in the distal tubule, we're generating a new bicarbonate. Now, the only thing that's difficult about looking at this picture is that the things are moving in what you might consider the opposite direction. Remember that most of the rest of the world is used to reading from left to right. You just have to understand here that it starts out here, 1, it starts out on this side, and only number 2 ends up over here on this side. So af means to. Afferent means to the glomerulus. Efferent, ef means from. Af and ef, to and from. Now this is saying, do you see, well, this is the macula densa over here, the macula densa. This is where we pick up sodium. Sodium concentration gets picked up there. Will a low sodium secrete aldosterone or a high sodium secrete aldosterone? Well, aldosterone will make you retain sodium. So if aldosterone makes you retain sodium, then the major stimulant to aldosterone release is a low sodium, because the low sodium will make you retain sodium to compensate for it. The macula densa, stimulated by sodium. Renin goes up because of hypotension. It's sensed at the juxtaglomerular cells. Hypotension is sensed here at the juxtaglomerular cells. Hypotension, what else makes it go up? Renin makes it go up. Renin makes it go up. Hypotension makes it go up. And what's the last stimulation that makes it go up? Renin is stimulated by hypotension. The JG cells pick it up. Renin is stimulated by hypotension, and the juxtaglomerular cells pick it up. Renin is stimulated by low sodium, and renin is stimulated by beta stimulation. Now, MAP means the mean arterial pressure, and the mean arterial pressure is a function of the cardiac output and TPR. TPR means total peripheral resistance. Mean arterial pressure is a function of cardiac output and the total peripheral resistance. If you increase the cardiac output but keep the resistance the same, you will end up having an increased pressure. If you increase cardiac output and you want to keep the mean arterial pressure the same, but I have increased the cardiac output, I can keep the mean arterial pressure the same by dilating the peripheral vasculature. So I increase cardiac output, and if I want to maintain the pressure the same, I decrease total peripheral resistance. Can you think of a drug that you can give someone to do that? Can you think of a drug that you can give that would do what we just said here, which would increase the cardiac output but decreases the total peripheral resistance? It's a drug that is used in people who have pulmonary edema. It increases the cardiac output, but on the other hand, it decreases peripheral resistance. What drug is used therapeutically in that way? Dobutamine. Dobutamine will increase cardiac output by increasing contractility and will maintain the blood pressure the same by decreasing resistance, decreasing afterload. So a patient comes to the emergency department. They're admitted with rales, tachycardia, hyperventilation, shortness of breath, S3 gallop, shortness of breath, edema, rales, jugular venous distension. Oxygen nitrates, fluids, don't fix it. Oxygen nitrates, diuretics, don't fix it. Oxygen nitrates, diuretics, don't fix it. What drug would you use next? What drug would you use next? And the answer is dobutamine. Dobutamine takes advantage of this calculation right here. Keeping the mean arterial pressure the same and increasing the cardiac output, we decrease the total peripheral resistance to keep that perfusion pressure the same. Our next slide represents one of the most important paradigm shifts in centuries, literally. It is not a small thing to look at the revolutionary change in the management of congestive failure, which is the most common admitting diagnosis in the United States. For decades, centuries, the management of congestive failure was based on two things: positive inotropes like digoxin and the ability to diurese the patient. The diuresis led to hypokalemia. The digoxin would therefore have increased toxicity. This fundamental paradigm shift was noticed by accident in people at Columbia University, noticing that in fact, for all the different modifications, it was the person who had a low sodium that died. Wow. Low sodium is what kills you? No, but low sodium as a marker for alterations in renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone. Now, digoxin does not decrease mortality. There's a lot that people will talk to you about the mechanisms of how digoxin works. As a matter of fact, one of the fastest ways to recognize if your step 1 teacher knows what they're talking about is how much they emphasize digoxin in congestive failure. If they're emphasizing digoxin, a drug which doesn't lower mortality, stay away. If they're emphasizing drugs that alter the renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone system, stay close. ACE inhibitors block angiotensin by blocking angiotensin 2. That's the part that you'll know. So the first part about this system is that we understand here with the ACE inhibitor where we're basically going to block the production of angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 is a vasoconstrictor, so ACE inhibitor dilate the vasculature and increases the forward flow of blood. Second, angiotensin 2 provokes the release of aldosterone. The entire zona glomerulosa, both at the level of desmolase and at the level of aldosterone synthase, are based on angiotensin 2 and potassium. So ACE inhibitors will open up the vasculature, and the ACE inhibitors will block the production of the zona glomerulosa. Again, excellent. Now, what happens if you have the development of the most common adverse effect of ACE inhibitors? And the most common adverse effect of ACE inhibitors is a cough. Now, that's a good mechanism question as well, which is to say, what is the mechanism of this? And it has to do with increasing bradykinins. If you have a cough from ACE inhibitors, the next best step in the management of the patient is to use an angiotensin receptor blocker. And the angiotensin receptor blocker, the ARB, losartan, valsartan, irbesartan, candesartan, telmisartan good, blocks the zona glomerulosa, blocks the attachment high up in the cycle with angiotensin 2 and low down aldosterone synthase. So ARBs, again, works on this system. Why? By blocking aldosterone. When you block aldosterone, you don't absorb sodium, And that's more important than the issue of this excretion of potassium and excretion of hydrogen ions. If we decompress the system and we don't absorb the sodium and water, we empty the system and things are better. Ready? If the heart is doing less work, you will live. More cardiac work, more oxygen consumption. More oxygen consumption, more ischemia. More cardiac work, more oxygen consumption, more wall tension. More work, oxygen consumption, more wall tension, more ischemia. More ischemia, sudden death, arrhythmia. At the end of the day, what makes those arrhythmias happen? Ischemia. If you decompress the system, the heart's not going to work as much. Do you understand now why digoxin is the wrong idea? Digoxin increases myocardial work, increases oxygen consumption. And that's why ultimately digoxin did not lower mortality. ACE and ARBs decrease myocardial work and oxygen consumption, and they lower mortality a lot. Now, in 1959, beta blockers were designed as antihypertensives. That's nice. But people said for 40 years, we need to avoid beta blockers, We need to avoid beta blockers in people who have congestive failure because they're negative inotropes. And this is a heart that has a contractility problem. If you give beta blockers to a person with congestive failure, you're going to worsen the contractility. You're going to worsen the cardiac output. You're going to worsen the ejection fraction. You're going to increase mortality. And for 40 years, we withheld them. In the late 90s, people were studying the effects of calcium channel blockers on coronary artery disease. And they found two things. One, calcium blockers don't help coronary disease. Number two, hey, look at that subset of patients who's on the beta blockers. Well, there's something, that can't be right. It looks like the subset of patients of beta blockers have a decreased mortality who have congestive failure. That doesn't make any sense. We all know beta blockers are bad in congestive failure. Must be wrong. So the study is repeated. And the most amazing thing was found by accident. That beta blockers lowered mortality. And they do it by this slide. Looking at this slide, let's see what beta blockers do. Beta blockers block the fact that increased beta stimulation increases renin. Beta stimulation increases renin. Beta blockers inhibit that. Oh no. Beta blockers are anti-ischemic. Beta blockers are anti-arrhythmic. Beta blockers lower mortality a lot in congestive failure because beta blockers work by inhibiting this action right there. Interestingly enough, we knew that beta stimulation increased renin for a long time, but we still didn't give the beta blockers. They were never studied. They were never studied not because they were dangerous. They were never studied because we knew they must be dangerous. So, what you should do is that the beta blockers, when studied, decrease beta stimulation to renin and inhibit the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. ACE and ARBs decrease aldosterone and also lower mortality. Give me another drug, a third class, fourth drug in a whole another class of medications. The other drug that lowers mortality in congestive failure, based on this slide right here, is spironolactone. Now, I'm going to ask you to think about what you think of spironolactone. And then we'll be able to judge whether you're in a great school or a mediocre school. Spironolactone, to you, is it predominantly a cardiac drug or is it predominantly a potassium-sparing diuretic? If you believe that spironolactone is classified as a potassium-sparing diuretic, then fundamentally your school is crap. Because we don't use spironolactone for diuresis 99% of the time. One rare exception is cirrhotic patients who have high aldosterone conditions. Spironolactone is a very weak diuretic because only 1 to 2% of sodium is reabsorbed at the distal tubule like that early collecting duct. 67% is at the proximal tubule. 25% is the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. 8% is at the distal tubule, where thiazides work. And what does that leave left? 1 to 2% at the late distal tubule. It's not a good diuretic. If your school told you spironolactone, that's a cardiac drug that lowers mortality by 25% in congestive failure, you're in the right place. Why would I tell you it's a potassium-sparing diuretic? Then you'll think it's a diuretic. Use it when you're fluid overloaded. Use it when somebody has hypertension. No. You use it for congestive failure. Do you know what 25% relative risk reduction is? You have a disease that kills hundreds of thousands of people. That could be tens of thousands of people whose lives are saved. Wow. Wow, that's a lot. 25% with spironolactone. Spironolactone works where? Spironolactone works directly down here. Spironolactone. Spironolactone works directly down here where it blocks aldosterone. Fantastic. This slide has more mortality benefit than any other slide in the entirety of the physiology section. Why? Because it has beta blockers, ACE and ARBs, and spironolactone in congestive failure. Wow. You see, the whole world is contained here within this one image. Depends what you see of it. Spironolactone blocks aldosterone. That decreases myocardial oxygen. Work consumption. It's an aldosterone antagonist that lowers mortality. 25%? That means you only need to treat 4 people. Wow. That's of an absolute risk reduction. But, you know, that doesn't mean that you have to treat that many people to get a lot of benefit. 4 people needed to treat to lower 1 life, to decrease mortality by 1 life. Wow. That's a lottery ticket I'll buy. People buy Mega Millions lottery tickets to win all those millions of bucks, which on average, if you buy 10 tickets a day, you win once every 400,000 years. That's the numbers. And here, 4 tickets, 1 life. Wow. Pretty cool. So that's the point out of this slide. Do not walk into step 1 without knowing this slide and the drugs and the congestive failure benefit and the hypertension benefit and the mortality benefit. So if I look like I have a feeling of this slide, the same way some people have a feeling of going into church, temple, mosque, shul, well, it's the truth. Because there is a temple to worship at that results in life. Wow. So, beta stimulation increases renin. Low sodium increases renin because aldosterone will increase the sodium. And hypovolemia increases renin by stimulating the juxtaglomerular cells. But when all the questions are going to look the same. A patient comes in and they're on a diuretic for their congestive failure and fluid overload. What is the mechanism of the medication that is most likely to benefit this patient? What is the mechanism of the benefit of the mechanism for the benefit for this patient? And it could be either inhibits aldosterone, inhibits angiotensin, inhibits production of angiotensin 2, or blocks renin itself. Now, for extra bonus points for the brand new car and the dream home in the city of your choice, here is another class of medications that blocks production of the renin. Now, this drug has not been shown to lower mortality in congestive failure yet. So, well, why bother studying it? It has not been shown, this new class of medications, to lower mortality in congestive failure because it hasn't been studied yet. But it's an approved medication, and if you're a second-year medical student looking at this right now, it was approved before you even started medical school. So I'm going to say the mechanism, and you're going to name the drug. And if you've heard of it in your medical school, that's great. It is a drug that is a direct inhibitor of renin. It is approved as an antihypertensive medication. and it is a drug that is waiting to be studied right now in congestive heart failure. It is a renin blocker that lowers high blood pressure, and it begins with Na. Al. Aliskiren, or aliskiran. Aliskirjont? No, aliskiren. Have you heard of this? It's a renin inhibitor. It's a renin inhibitor, aliskiren. Now, physiologic changes in aldosterone secretion, basically anything that makes the blood pressure, low, anything that decreases volume, anything that decreases volume is going to increase aldosterone, because aldosterone in the long term makes you retain sodium in water and increases blood pressure. Anything that decreases aldosterone is something that basically does the opposite. If you raise blood pressure and raise volume, it'll shut off your aldosterone, because it will shut off beta stimulation. Remember, hypotension, beta stimulation. Hypotension, baroreceptors. Increase the beta stimulation, increase the heart rate and the contractility, and simultaneously increase the production of renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. Also, hypotension causes the problem with the juxtaglomerular cells, and the JG cells stimulate more and make you increase the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. You must know that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system cold. A patient comes with congestive failure. They're on an ACE inhibitor. They need another medication. What is the mechanism? The wrong answers will be inhibit sodium potassium ATPase. That's digoxin. The wrong answers will be block sodium reabsorption at the distal tubule. That's thiazides. The wrong answer will be block sodium reabsorption at the thick ascending limb. That's a diuretic. That's Lasix, furosemide. Wrong answer. The wrong answer will be inhibits sulfhydryl groups in the venous circulation. That's nitrates. The wrong answer will be inhibits atrial natriuretic peptide. That's nesiritide. It doesn't lower mortality. So you see how easy it is to construct a question like that? The wrong answers will be loop diuretics, thiazides, ANP inhibitors, nitrates. The right answer could be beta blocker, ACE, ARB, spironolactone.